Before I start, I'm going to start. Up here I have a bunch of different books, CDs, pictures from all written about the Flying Tigers. There were 317 of them. There's only 3 remaining alive. This is the basic armament, 50 caliber and a 30 caliber. Big difference in the shells. And notice in particular how the P-40 sits. That's how it's set on the runway, and that's part of the presentation. So it sits with the nose up in the air. There's different books here. I brought the best books that I thought are on the Flying Tigers. This first one is a pictorial history. Just be careful when you pick up the books because it's holding the banner up. We don't want the banner to fall. And probably the best video you see on TV or the CD is Fei Hu is Chinese or Flying Tigers. Not the John Wayne Flying Tigers. Fei Hu. You see it on the History Channel, Military Channel. This is the first model that they flew, the Tomahawk. The Tomahawk has 250 calibers in each wing and 250s synchronized to shoot between the propeller. The Tomahawk. It could do about 360 miles an hour, climb to about 15,000 feet. Had the Allison engine in it, about 1,100 horsepower. Later on, they got the advanced model of the Warhawk, which had 350 calibers in each wing. Tremendous firepower. The 50 calibers, every 5th round was black-tipped, armor-piercing. Also, every 5th round was red-tipped tracer, so they could see where the bullets were going. Each of the magazines to hold the 50 calibers, they held about 270, 290 pieces of ammo. And what they did is they put when they first started flying, they put the traces. They were intermingled in with the ammunition. And then later on, they put them at the end of the 290 rounds. It told them they were out of ammunition. It also told the Japanese they were out of ammunition and they run home. That was developed, too, during World War II. They took that model and they used it in most of the fighters. The latest book out, many of you don't know, Chenault had a 2-phase plan. Phase 1 was actually what happened. Go over to China with the P-40s and work for the Chinese government. Phase 2, which is this preemptive strike. This is written by a friend of mine, Alan Armstrong. He's an aviation attorney out in Atlanta, Georgia, and he also owns a Japanese torpedo bomber, which he flies at different air shows. But anyway, Phase 2 was to bring in B-17s and B-24s into the China-Burma-India War after the P-40s. The B-17s were flying in to Pearl the day they bombed Pearl Harbor to be ferried over. So Phase 2 never happened. B-17s went over to the European theater. Interesting book. But that was Phase 2. So that was his plan. With that, I'm going to start the presentation because I'm going too much into it. If you have any questions during the presentation, just yell out. That's the P-40, built by Curtiss Wright Corporation. You can shut the lights out if you want. Go ahead. Nope, give me some. Okay. When I do presentations, I don't do schools because the kids really, I only do schools that have aviation classes or aeronautic classes. And I do that because they really don't, they can't comprehend what I'm talking about. Now the schools are just getting into having veterans come in and talk to them. But when I do schools, I do it on over a two-day period because of the 2 days because of the shortness of the periods. So when I go in, I ask the kids if they ever heard of the Flying Tigers, and they tell me Yeah. Oh, then that's the next slide. This here is their symbol, Flying Tiger and the blue V for victory. This was personally designed for them by Walt Disney. Walt Disney Studios did a lot of the nose art during World War II, a lot of it. But this particular one was designed personally by by Walt Disney. And when I asked them if they ever heard of the Flying Tigers, those who know, this is what they tell me. Yeah, John Wayne was a Flying Tiger. But he really, John Wayne and Tex Hill was probably the most famous Flying Tiger. They had a personal relationship. They were neighbors before the war and after the war. Actually, John Wayne and Tex Hill worked on the original King Kong movie. We had Tex Hill and Peter Wright at the museum years ago for an entire weekend. And Tex Hill, the stories he told was like he was there yesterday. Usually when we bring a guest into the museum on the Friday night before the Saturday presentation or the Sunday presentation, we have a private dinner with members of the museum, only about 50 or 60 members. And after the dinner, we bring out some refreshments, and Tex's favorite refreshment was Kentucky bourbon. And as he spoke during the night, the stories got better and better and better. In the 1930s, Japan entered China to conquer them, mainly for the natural resources. Japan had no natural resources, so they went in and they conquered China. This is the bombing of Nanking in the late 1930s. You probably know about the rape of Nanking, where they literally murdered almost 600,000 Chinese people in a matter of 8 weeks. The Air Force they had at the time was the first Air Force was run by the Italians. Italy aligned with Germany in the war, so the Russians came in and organized it a little more, but it was still antiquated with the biplanes. Chenault at the time was out of the service. He was basically drummed out of the service because of his what he thought the Air Force could do. He was similar to Billy Mitchell of World War I. He's way ahead of his time, and his plan was to bring in the pursuit fighters, the P-40. The P stood for pursuit. Now today they have F for fighters. Anyway, so his wingmen there, Williamson and McDonald, and Chenault, they flew air shows similar to the Blue Angels of today. They did county fairs, etc. And they did formation flying. They tied ropes onto the wingtips, and they did maneuvers and all that stuff. So Williamson and McDonald went over to China first as aides to Chiang Kai-shek, really to Madam Chiang, who was the real power. They contacted Chenault to see if he wanted to come over for 6 months, and he met with Madam Chiang and Chiang Kai-shek, better known as the Peanut. Yes, sir.
Tom, at that time, what was his rank? What was his military background? Where did he come from?
He came from the Army Air Corps. He was a colonel. So he went over there as a military advisor out of the Army. It had nothing to do with the U.S. Army. He went over as a civilian advisor. So, is that what you mean?
Was he sent by the U.S. or
No.
was his
No.
own initiative?
He had a plan, and his plan was frowned upon by everybody. But he had two people who really liked his plan, his two-phase plan. One was President Roosevelt, and one was Winston Churchill, and that's all that mattered. But he went over as a civilian advisor. They went over, their original name when they went over was the American Volunteer Group. They were mercenaries. They worked for the Chinese government. He was paid $2,000 a month. Pilot was paid around $600 a month. Squadron leader was paid about $700 a month, and the ground crews, 200 of them, were paid anywhere from $200 to $300. Big money back then. So he went over as a civilian advisor, supposedly for 6 months, but it wound up being the entire war. Also, What was not, they signed a 1-year contract to work for the Chinese government. What was not in the contract was for every Japanese aircraft shot down, they would get a $500 bonus. And they did pay that. William Pauley was the Curtis Wright representative. Part of Chennault's plan was to send out representatives to the different branches of the service and recruit 100 pilots and 250 ground personnel, armorers, mechanics, nurses, doctors, etc. They wound up with the 100 pilots, mostly Navy pilots, and they wound up with only 317 of the 350. So Curtis Wright, William Pauley set up dummy offices, a dummy office in One Rockefeller Plaza in New York, and he sent his representatives to the different military bases to recruit. Basically, all the enlisted and officers had to resign from their branch of service and sign a 1-year contract, which was approved, as I said, by Roosevelt. When he got to the Navy, the admiral wouldn't release any of his pilots, so it took a personal handwritten letter by President Roosevelt, and that did the trick. They sailed as mechanics, engineers, farmers, etc. It's supposed to be top secret. They sailed on Dutch freighters from San Francisco and from New York, and they went over with 100 P-40s. The 100 P-40s were originally destined for France, but France was invaded by Germany, so they were going to the British, and President Roosevelt guaranteed the British the next model, which was the Warhawk, if he would release him to the American Volunteer Group, the AVG, which he did. It's supposed to be a top secret mission. As I said, they went over different occupations, teachers, etc. The day before they were sailing, Japan, one of the early Tokyo Roses came on the radio and detailed the plan right to the docks that they were going to sail out of. Thus, President Roosevelt gave them a naval escort all the way over to Burma. Here they are having a little tea before they go. The P-40 was shipped in 2 containers. One had the fuselage, the other had the wing and tail assembly. They went over, those went from New York Harbor. One of them fell overboard, so they went over with 99 P-40s. Here they are being assembled in low-wing China. The 12-point star is being put on. They had to put on, some of them they had to even install engines, the machine guns, etc. While they were installing the engines, airfields had to be built. Large rocks into small rocks. All the airfields, with the exception of one, were made of rocks. I've been to China twice, courtesy of the Chinese government. Some of these airfields are still there. They're not in use, but they're still there. And after they finished spreading all these rocks, they brought out these gigantic stone rollers. You can't see it, but it's pulled by, 50, 75, 100 men to roll the rocks down. Every time it rained, it drove the sand down, the rocks came up, so they brought out the rollers constantly. And at the same time, they had to plant their staple crop, which is rice. Today, their staple crop is corn, believe it or not, corn and chilies. My first trip over there, we left Kunming, China in a military escort. It was unbelievable. It was just like a presidential motorcade. Chinese soldiers at every corner stopping traffic, letting us through. Anyway, we're driving on the New Burma Highway, and I see yellow all over the place. Yellow on the ground, yellow on the roof, yellow hanging. And I asked my interpreter, I said, "What is that?" She said, "That's corn." And I said, "Why corn? Isn't it rice?" She says, "No, it's our staple crop now is corn." I said, "Well, don't the birds eat it?" And she said to me, "We don't have any birds." And I laughed, and the Chinese don't joke. They don't joke. Many, many years ago, she said that the Chinese government made the Chinese people kill as many birds as they can because of the poor Chinese people, it would eat their crops. And I'm serious when I said my first trip I did not see any birds at all. And I'll tell you where I saw the birds later on, but very strange. And chili peppers hanging. And at the same time, Chenault gave them 60 hours of classroom work, and they had 70 hours of flight instruction. He personally gave them the classroom work. He taught them formation flying, and also when they pilot and a flight leader, 2-on-2. And he taught them the main tactic was to fly high, preferably about between 13 and 15,000 feet, and dive on the enemy with the sun at their back. The P-40 could outrun the Japanese Zero, but on a straightaway, the Japanese Zero would overtake him because it was very light. The P-40 could withstand the dive, a Japanese Zero could not. And he also told them over and over and over, do not engage in a dogfight with the Japanese, because the Japanese Zero being lighter, they'll turn and eventually get on the P-40's tail. So that was the two main tactics. Go high, dive, pick up speed, come back, do the same thing, and don't engage in a dogfight. He also told them if they were coming on a Japanese aircraft head on, don't turn away, because their machine guns would reach the Japanese Zero before the Japanese armament would reach them. Here's the different aircraft that they flew. All the Japanese fighters were given male nicknames. Jack, Tokyo, I get that. Paul, Zeke. So they were all given male nicknames because they couldn't pronounce the Japanese names. All the bombers were given female names: Sally, Betty, etc. This is a mock-up of a P-40 cockpit. This is also one of the original training aids that they used. This is part of my collection at the museum. A pilot would sit down in front of this mock-up. All the instruments, gauges, handles would be numbered. So if he said number 35 was the altimeter, he would pull one of the tabs down and see if it was correct. So that was one of their training aids for those who never flew in a P-40. There were only about 4 pilots who ever flew in a P-40. Very difficult aircraft, very heavy aircraft, heavily armored, etc. Most of them flew other fighters and other transport aircraft. This is part of my collection. During their training, as I said, many of them did not had difficulty with flying the P-40. They lost a third of their aircraft in training before the first battle. These two aircraft, I told you how the P-40 sits on the ground. Well, when they sit on the ground, they're supposed to zigzag, go from left to right so they could see where they were going. These two zigzagged at the wrong time, and they crashed. All these wrecks became their parts bank. They received no parts during their 1-year contract. The only supplies that received were ammunition and fuel. Tex Hill told us that when the tires wore out, whoops, let me go back. Sorry. When the tires wore out, the natives, Chinese or the Burmese people, would take hemp rope and wrap it around the rim. And that was good for 2 or 3 takeoff and landings. Finally, they got their act together, and they put this wing sitter on to guide them while they're on the ground. And you notice the shark teeth there, and I'll tell you that in a minute. Here, they finally got their act together. This is the squadron at Kunming. None of their air bases did they ever have more than 12 aircraft. They had satellite fields, too, in addition to the main bases. And the satellite fields were only to stop, pick up fuel and ammunition. And they fooled the Japanese on those, too, because they gave them nicknames. Instead of them being a Chungking or Low Wing China, they gave them nicknames like Johnny Walker 7 and 7, Haig, which you all know what that is. So that was the nicknames of the Chinese bases. The shark teeth on the P-40, this came from a British magazine, which is also part of my collection. One of the pilots saw this shark teeth on the P-40 from a British squadron in Africa, and he took it to Chenault, and he asked them if he could put it on their on his aircraft. And Chenault said, no, we're going to put it on all the aircraft. And they did that for a couple of reasons. Number one, the superstition about the shark itself, the ferociousness of the teeth, and so that's how they got the shark teeth on the P-40. The spinner here, because of there being anywhere from 6 to 12 aircraft at each location, they would change the color of the spinners almost on a daily basis or weekly basis. Paint the tips also, so it would tell the Japanese supposedly they had more aircraft than they actually did. They also changed the numbers on the side, 114, 126, 47. So that was one of the ploys they used also. They had 3 squadrons. First squadron was the first pursuit or Adam and Eve squadron. Second one was a panda bear in tribute to the Chinese people. And the third was the Hell's Angels, and that was named after a 1930s Gene Harlow movie. There's also variations of this I can't show you too. They were very creative, let's say that. Here they are with the P-40 and the old biplanes there. The Chinese pilots were not allowed to fly the P-40, or I shouldn't say weren't allowed, they weren't trained, but they were trained to continue flying the bi-wing aircraft and go over and map the area out. They had no maps at the time. So what they did, both the Chinese and the American, the AVG, would go out and hand draw different type of maps. Then they would come back, run them off on the old mimeograph machine. So those were their aerial maps. Of the 317, there were 6 Asians. Here's 5 of them and 1 in the cockpit. One of them only died a few years ago, Henry Lee, not the Henry Lee from Connecticut, but so those were the 6 Asians that came along. 6 American Asians, I should say. Chenault was involved in every planning of every mission. Tex Hill told us, excuse me, Tex Hill told us he's a very dynamic guy. Somebody that when you first met him, he instilled confidence in you, somebody you would trust and wanted to hang around with. And he had deep black eyes. Yes, sir.
To what extent, you may not be about to answer my question. To what extent did the Chinese actually occupy Burma? Percentage of land?
I don't know what the Chinese, but it was basically the firm.
I mean the Japanese.
The Japanese? Well, at different times during the year and other previous years, they were advancing into Western China from Kunming, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. But their main mission, AVG's main mission, and Japanese were advancing very quickly because there was no forces to prevent them from advancing, basically. Chinese forces were more or less governed by different warlords, I should say. Even Chiang Kai-shek, who was given the latest military armament and everything and supplies, held a lot of it back because he didn't want to give power to other warlords, etc. So anyway, their main objective was to protect the Burma Road, over 700 miles of twisting, turning, serpentine road, and that went from Kunming, China, all the way down to Rangoon. Here's the road. Parts of it are still there today, and if you look over here, this gorge could be a mile down. No guardrails. And parts of the new highway, which is alongside the old Burma Road, parts of that have no guardrails at all. And once the sides going down are always wet because they have water-cooled brakes. You could go up 2,000 feet, come down 4,000 feet, go up 1,000 feet, come down 3,000 feet, up and down, up and down. So our convoy traveled on the new Burma Road. And if truck went over, they salvaged what they could, keep that convoy going. That was the only supply route at the time. The the hump came later on in the war, so that was their only route to get supplies to Kunming, up or down to Rangoon. We were driving on the New Burma Road, maybe 35, 40 minutes, and you see nobody. But you see Chinese peasants, the older people, with straw brooms sweeping the highway. Come out from nowhere. We couldn't see any huts, shacks, houses, or anything. And all along the Burma Road, there would be intimately Chinese people sweeping the highway. Once you get out of major cities, it's just like you step through a door into back centuries. They still till the land with an ox. In my 2 trips, I've never seen a tractor. I've seen one rototiller, but they're there from sunup to sunset with their one child, either in the field working or on the back or in some type of chair. And it's still antiquated, very antiquated. This is one of their barracks. This is at Rangoon. They varied according to, their style varied according to where they were. Here it is, no maid service here. This is where they sleep. And Tex told us, you could see the mosquito netting and the rafters going back and forth. Tex told us that the mosquito netting, when they went to sleep at night, the rats would run back and forth. And that's what the mosquito netting was for. He also told us in this location, when they went to chow, they brought 2 plates with them. Because as soon as they got their food, they would cover their plates because birds would fly in and try and take the food. This is an alert shack. Alert shack is when they're on duty waiting to hear word that the Japanese are coming. This is the alert tent in Rangoon. This is the alert shack in Chungking. The uniforms that they went over with were basically uniforms they wore on their back. There was no standard uniform. The only closely the closest thing to a standard uniform was their Class A's. Once they got over there, they shared one base with the British at Tungu. British gave them a lot of uniform parts. They have a lot of theater-made jackets, pants, etc. This is Tex Hill and his armorer, Matt Kuykendall. And the phone here, they're waiting to hear word that the Japanese are coming. How did they know the Japanese were coming? This here is another one. This here is Tom Cole. Tom Cole was one of 4 pilots who did engage in a dogfight. And the day of, shortly after this picture was taken, I'm told, his aircraft was shot up, he bailed out, and on the way down, the Japanese Zero machine gunned him to death. This here is his best buddy, 19 years old, Tom Cole, his name escapes me. Anyway, his best buddy, he went up and he did engage the Japanese in a dogfight, shot down 2 of them. He had a tip of his finger shut off, took a head wound. Chenault grounded him for 2 weeks so he would heal. He got so PO'd at Chenault, they had a big argument. Chenault said, "Go back flying, don't bother me." How did they know when the Japanese were coming? They didn't have any radar at the time, so Chenault developed this Jingbao ball alert. These are Jingbao balls. You see them now. They're made of crepe paper and bamboo or whatever. What Chenault did is he set up radio stations near every Japanese base, regardless of where they were, either the Chinese military ran them or else farmers ran them too. So when Japanese were alerted to go fly, when they ran to their airplanes, that particular Japanese or Burmese people around that base would send a message to the central location in Kunming, and they would send up the first Jingbao ball telling them that the Japanese are now preparing to fly. Went to every AVG base. When the second Jingbao ball went up, it usually meant that they were 50 miles or 15 minutes out. But what the Japanese did most of the time is they would change direction to fool the Americans. So the pilots never ran out to their aircraft until a third Jing bow ball went up, and that meant they were really 15 minutes away. This is a bunch of the peasant. Let me go back. Okay. This is our pilots running to their aircraft with a 40-pound parachute. Here they are taking off. All the piles here, the Japanese were still bombing the fields at that time. So as soon as the Japanese bombers left, the Chinese or Burmese people would come out and fill the craters with these rocks. The British flew the British Buffalo, considered the worst fighting aircraft in World War II. Remember I told you that Chennault told his pilots never engage in a dogfight with the Japanese. Well, the British commandant told his pilots, if you run from the Japanese, we'll court-martial you. Thus, most of them got shot down. This is American-made aircraft. Here they are. This is low-wing China. This is one of the fields that it's still there. It's in a valley between mountains, and there's a gondola going up to the top of the mountain. I took the gondola up to the top of the mountain. When I got there, there were about 25 Chinese students. They recognized my jacket that I was wearing, and I'll explain that later. And one of them asked me if he could take a picture with me, and I'm telling them I'm not a Flying Tiger, original Flying Tiger. They didn't care. And I made the mistake of taking my jacket off and having him wear it and have a picture. Well, I had to do it for all the other 24 of them, too. But those, they all spoke English, and they all knew about the Flying Tigers. And if people around them, if they didn't know about the Flying Tigers, they would instantly say, Fei Hu, Fei Hu. In China, they teach math, history, and English. And the emphasis on history is what Flying Tigers did for China during World War II. I could go to the most remote town, and the people there, you would hear them yell out, Fei Hu, Fei Hu, Fei Hu. Some of them were crying and everything because they remember Chennault, and I'll tell you more about it later on. This is a direct hit by a Japanese bomber on one of the hangars. The slit trench here, manned by 30 caliber, Tex Hill said it had no effect. They never shot down an aircraft or anything, but it gave morale to the Chinese people. Once they came over, Japanese would bomb all over, and there were a few pilots, a few ground crews that were killed by the bombings. But the slit trenches, the 30 caliber machine guns had no effect, never shot anybody down, but it did boost the morale of the Chinese people. This is R.T. Smith, one of the more colorful pilots. He probably took more pictures than anybody else. This here is an optical gun sight. Very unreliable. Tex told us that it lights up, but the vibrations of the aircraft, and even just climbing into the aircraft and holding on up here would throw it out of sync. So they developed this ring and post gun sight. This was made by the AVG mechanics. Here's from the cockpit. Basically, the post would be out further out on the aircraft nose, and once it reached in the bullseye center, they would fire. Now, what was an effective firing range? Here they took a P-40 and they put the tail on a flatbed truck to simulate level flying, and they bore sighted the machine guns. By bore sighting, and they did night bore sighting too. By bore sighting, I mean, if you look down a railroad track, the optical illusion is you think they come to a point. Well, with the bore sighting, they actually do, and they figured an effective firing range was between 300 and 400 yards down, and that's when they could fire and turn away from flak, or not from flak, but from debris flying off the P-40. So their 50 calibers were bore sighted to not come to a point, but have that spread so it would cover the entire aircraft. This is a picture of a Japanese aircraft that was hit. And here it is going down. this first or second battle, there was a Chinese reporter on the ground, and they watched the dogfight, or they watched the fighting between Japanese Zeros and the P-40s. And the Japanese reported, he wrote in the newspaper and reported that the American volunteer group fought like Flying Tigers. That's how they got the Flying Tiger name. The main bomber in that theater of war was a Sally bomber. Here's one of the ground crews waiting for his particular pilot to return. There's Tex Hill and the boys coming back from a successful mission. And this is a pilot who came late, and he was given a dishonorable discharge by Chenault and sent home. He and Chenault never hit it off. He liked to drink. He liked to fight his own people, his own pilots when he drank. And Chenault forbid them to do any low-level flights, and you can see all the guys hitting the deck here. This is the pilot. This is Pappy Boynton, Black Sheep Squadron. Medal of Honor winner, shot down 24 Japanese, 26 aircraft, depending who you talk to. I met him many, many years ago. Naturally, you get older, you regret what you did in your younger life and all that. But he was given a dishonorable discharge, came home at an old age of 26, couldn't get into service. Marines took him. They take anybody. No, I'm only kidding. But the Marines took him, and he fought in the Pacific Theater of War. As I said, became a Medal of Honor winner. Spent last year or two in the Japanese POW camp. Very high price was put on his head, but the Japanese never really did anything to him. This is one of the squadron's Olsen and Company exterminators, Ole Olsen. Here's a Chinese soldier pointing to the blood chit on the back of a jacket. And I have one down here, and I'll explain it later on. But what the blood chit is, this is the flag of China at the time. This is now the flag of Formosa, or Taiwan. I've had a couple of Japanese film crews come from China to do documentaries on the Flying Tigers, and they always come to the museum, and they start there. And both film crews, on two different occasions, that would be at my back, and they would film me, and they would stop everything and move away. And one of my good friends who was at one of these groups a long time ago, I said, when? What's the matter? She says, well, that's the flag of Taiwan now, and they're still fearful that if they show it on their TV, on their documentary, they're going to be punished. So they moved me away. They moved me away, fearful of this, showing this Taiwan flag. Anyway, I had another older Chinese couple when I was doing a presentation at the museum. After the presentation was over, they asked me if I knew how the flag was made. I said no. He said, well, the blue represents the sky, the clouds are white, and the star. The red represents all the Chinese people killed over the different dynasties. So it represents the blood of the people killed. This is what they call a chop. When we sign something, we call it a signature. When they sign something, that's what it is. It's a chop. So that's the personal chop of Chiang Kai-shek. The writing, they wore it on their jackets, on the back of their flight suits. Some of them wore it inside their jacket. If they had the bailout crash land and other than in their own bases, it told the Chinese people, protect them from the Japanese, you will be rewarded, they're friends of China. That's what it basically said. They had numbers from 3 up to 350. They're probably worth, if you're lucky to get one, $100,000 today. I have one inside the jacket, I'll show you later. I've been offered $8,000 for it. I'm also proud to say I've never sold a piece of my collection. Never was in it for profit, but for the preservation of the American Volunteer Group. This is the tail of one of the bombers that were shot down. The gull the gull emblems here signifies what base it came from. The main base of the Japanese was in Hanoi. Here's a Sally bomber that was shot down. This here This is one of the engines from the Sally Bomber. Down here it says it's a 14-cylinder engine that was designed in the United States. The Japanese, as I said, committed atrocities unbelievable. If you ever read the book, The Rape of Nanking, it's just unreal. The woman who wrote the book, The Rape of Nanking, after she wrote it, she committed suicide. She was so depressed. Anyway, here is a Japanese crew member that was captured. Texil told us that they would interrogate him for a day or two and then take him back to Central Command, or try and get him back to Central Command. None of the pilots ever made it. The AVG would hide them the night before they were going to be picked up to take to Central Command in Kunming. But the Chinese people always came and found them and usually executed them because of all the atrocities that were committed. Their other main objective was to bomb supply trains and blow bridges. Here there's direct hit on a bridge by a 500-pound. The main armament was a 35-pound bomb, 100-pound bomb, and 500-pound bomb. Here, this is the Warhawk, the later model. You can see the 35-pound bombs, 350 calibers. I have a 35-pound bomb and a 100-pound bomb in my collection. 500-pound bomb. The bomb racks, all different, put up by, made by the different armorers and mechanics. Many of the pilots that were killed, or the ground crews that were killed, some of them were buried over there. This is the funeral of Ed Liebolt. Ed Liebolt, this is him here. Ed Liebolt was one of those 4 pilots who did engage in a dogfight and was shot down and killed. Many, many years ago, his family contacted me, and they asked me if I would be interested in his wings and his 2 patches, his ID card and his bullet. Ed was one of those guys who believed in as long as he carried his bullet with him, nothing would happen to him. The day of his fatal mission, he left everything in the barracks. This is part of my collection. The wings, the 2 patches are on my jacket here. This is Emma Hanks, nicknamed Red Hanks, and John Petosh. She was one of 2 nurses. They married. At the end of their 1-year contract, Chenault asked some of them to stay on to help train the new crews that were coming in. John was already packed. Emma asked him, aren't you going to stay and help Chenault? And he said, no, I thought you wanted to go home, because she was pregnant at the time. He stayed for the 2 weeks. The Friday of at the end of the 2 weeks, he was shot down and killed. I met her many times, a great woman. Here is maintenance on the P-40. The dummy company that was set up was Camco, Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, as I said, based in Rockefeller Center, New York. Had no employees. The maintenance on the P-40s could be done very easily by the Burmese and the Chinese people, and here they are doing maintenance on P-40s. You see this particular one all shot up. Very heavily armored. This is 3/4 inch steel all around. The tanks were self-sealing. As I said, there were no supplies ever given to them or gotten to them, without the exception of ammunition and fuel, and later on tires. But naturally, the maintenance on the engines had to be done. This is the 3rd Pursuit Squadron, their engine status board. Allison engine was the original engine, but also it was in the original P-39, the P-40, the first P-51 Mustang, and the P-38. Later on, the Merlin engine came in, more horsepower, a little higher, a little faster.
Water cooled?
No, air cooled. This one here took It's an artist drawing, but this one particular took, I don't know, 17 hits and was still able to land. You guys remember the old Army, Navy, or military store in the Berlin Turnpike? He had one in there for years and years and years. And I almost bought it from him. And I went back to try and negotiate again, and it was gone. And he said somebody bought it and put it in his boat. Here's one of the P-40s, right? Wrong. The Chinese people and the Burmese people built all these dummy aircraft all over, bamboo and paper. So the Japanese would come over, and these would be out in the wide open, and they bomb them, and they would report, we destroyed all the aircraft at whatever base they were. There's a whole squadron of dummy aircraft. The one paved airfield that they flew out of, which they shared with the British, they leased from the British, was at Tungu. Here's Chenault. Chenault had one favorite pastime. Every time they had time off, he would love to play it. It was baseball, not golf. Loved to play baseball. Loved to beat the British. Tex told us the few times that the British beat them, you couldn't talk to Chenault for a day or two. He was so PO'd. Kunming, the #1 hostel. Barracks are called hostels at that time. So this is the #1 hostel, and also the headquarters in Kunming, China. This building is still there. I've been in it. It's amazing how preserved it is. It's now the museum for the Flying Tigers. It's this old building in the middle of Kunming, China. It also housed the 2nd and 3rd squadrons, which was over their hostels or barracks are over to the right of it. This here is a section of Kunming, which looks almost the same when I was there. Here's one of the AVG guys. And I told you there were no birds in China. Well, this here is the Green Park, entrance to the Green Park, which is still there, same thing. I went to the Green Park, and in the Green Park are the grandparents, usually babysitting their one grandchild. They're in there doing their exercises, they're playing their board games, they're playing their instruments, and that's the only place you see birds. And there's naturally koi and fish and all that. Most of the birds there were household birds that escape, parakeets, cockatoos, canaries that escape. And it's like they know where to go, so nothing would happen to them. That's the only place I've ever seen birds in China. There they are in their favorite swimming home, latest bathing suit. Here they are at the Silver Grill bar. That's still there today in the same location, a little more modern, but it was just like a movie. They would go out and fight, come back, shower, and go into town for a few drinks. And see the 3rd Squadron emblem on the back. This here, some of them did some humanitarian work, very, very little humanitarian work. This is a bracelet that came from an AVG mechanic. 7 bracelets were made by a nun and presented to them and 6 other members of the Flying Tigers in appreciation for the contribution and assistance in an orphanage. And each of the sides have .30 caliber bullets. In the middle it says Mother Mary. Each one is hand-etched a pagoda and a serpent. Pagoda and a serpent. That's part of my collection. The mechanic's family notified me or asked me many years ago if I wanted it. While the AVG was flying, the Japanese would drop pamphlets. This is one of the original pamphlets they dropped to the Chinese people, telling the people that the Americans were mercenaries, they would drunks, they would rape and kill their people, they would steal their animals, take their homes, etc. Had no effect whatsoever. Once the Flying Tigers, the AVG started flying, the bombing stopped in that section of war. They only fought for 7 months in actual combat. And in that 7 months of combat, they shot down 299 confirmed kills and another 159 probables. At that time, it was right after Pearl Harbor, you have to know. So the morale in the United States and with the Allies was very, very low. So to build a morale, they really played up the Flying Tigers in Life magazine, New York Times, and the main spokesman on the radio at the time was John Daly. Remember him from What's My Line? And the odds that the Americans flew against the Japanese were 15-1. Here's some more. Some more. Their first battle was on Christmas Eve when they shot down 9 of the 10 Sally bombers. And when they started fighting, the Japanese are very regimented. So when they dove on those 10 Sally bombers, they would shoot 1 or 2 down and the others would stay in formation. Very regimented. Took many, many battles there after that. The Japanese would start to scatter. On Christmas Day, they fought 80 bombers and 48 fighters. They shot down 23, 6 more probables with no AVG losses. That was their biggest battle. The Brewster Buffaloes had also shot down 33, and 22 of them were lost. Of course, they engaged in dogfights. Their last battle, the bridge at the Salween River Gorge, this was separating eastern China into western China. The Chinese government found out that the 2 divisions of the 5th Imperial Japanese Army, Red Dragon Division, were coming to the bridge to cross over. 20,000 troops, 19 miles long, armored divisions. Here's the bridge. Chinese government blew the bridge. When the Japanese got to that portion of the bridge here, they started building pontoon bridges across. This is Tex Hill and the boys. Actually, there were four of them. They went in on the first bombing run. Tex Hill came down. He dropped a 500-pound bomb right at the base where they were building, I should say on the cliff where they were building the pontoon bridges, which created a rock slide. It stopped them there. There's another 4 aircraft up here, went to the other end of that 19-mile column and did the same thing. They boxed them in. For the next 5 days, they did nothing but repeatedly going back and bombing and destroying that entire 20,000 Japanese troops. Now the mountains, the ridges were very high, so very few of them could escape. This is an old Ford tri-motor. They would strap bombs on the outside. This is a light sander. And they would also throw the bombs, 35-pound bombs out the window. They even had Russian aircraft that they used. For that, they were awarded China's highest medal, which was the White Cloud banner. And these are the pilots that were involved, and they were personally pinned on them by Madame Chang. Madame Chang, by the way, was educated in the United States. She spoke perfect Southern English. Her whole family was Methodist. So her and Chenault hit it off. He being from Louisiana, they hit it off day one. And she was the real power behind the Chinese. This is the White Cloud banner. I have 2 of them in my collection. The AVG created 26 aces, and aces that shoot down 5 or more Japanese aircraft. This is Robert Neal. Robert Neal, highest scoring ace, 19 kills. R.T. Smith had 9 victories. Here's R.T. on the right and Chuck Older on the left. Chuck Older had 10.5 kills with the AVG and 8 after they disbanded and became part of the 23rd Fighter Group. You don't know the name Chuck Older, but Chuck Older was the Charlie Manson trial judge. Here he is when they switched over to P-51 Mustangs, where he got additional kills. At the end, when I said that Chenault asked some of them to stay on to help train, There were 7 of them, 7 of the ground crews that stayed. Naturally, the tallest and one of the Asian Americans. And you see they painted over the star on them too. This here, he came in at the end, and he was the command. He took over Chenault's place and commanded the 23rd Fighter Group. This here is Robert Scott. God is my co-pilot author. Here he is with his kills. Here they are then, and good-looking guys back then. Charlie Bond is the only one alive today. That's Tex Hill. Charlie Bond bailed out, shot down 3 times, crash landed, whatever. You can see he's all burned up here. He hired a Chinese student to teach him fluent Chinese. He stayed in the military, became a major general in the Air Force. Ken Jernstedt was a California senator for many, many years, 10.5 kills. Charlie Mott, one of the very first, in the early days, shot down and spent the entire war in a Japanese POW camp. This is Dick Rossi. Dick Rossi headed the Flying Tiger Association. He died about 2 years ago. That's him. That's him then. That's him. That was him 2 years ago.
Gratitude. We'd like to present you with our little plaque.
Outstanding.
Say thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's always a pleasure coming back here.